Hello everyone and good evening. Today I will talk about apples, all about apples. I'll focus on four major areas. It's going to be quite a long presentation, so grab your tea or coffee, sit back, relax, enjoy the stories. I will focus on apple overview, varieties, overall history, how apples came to the United States, and then quite a long section on Prescott and Yavapai apple history, a little bit on how to make an apple tree and grafting basics, and then importance on heritage apple preservation. So a little bit about me. As you can see, I'm an apple maniac. I wear an apple t-shirt. Apples and fruit trees are my biggest hobby, so I do have a day job, but anytime I'm not doing my day job, I'm pretty much researching apples, planting apples, eating apples, reading about apples. I read apple books for fun. My refrigerator is filled with apple scions for about 3 to 4 months out of the year, so really don't have space for much food in it because we store apple scion wood sticks in the fridge. We spend every vacation looking for old apple trees and old orchards. For Halloween, we had carved apples instead of pumpkins. I hugged probably more apple trees than I hugged people in the last few years. And we trampled through the snow, rain, and the cold weather in the winter time to collect scion wood. So that's pretty much my life over the last 3 years. How did it all start? I grew up in Lithuania. This photograph is from about 1981. Perhaps I was 5 or 6 years old. My grandpa holding a Northern European white stork that was injured on a farm. And my grandpa, whose name was Anton, grew Antonovka apples, one of the most famous, popular Russian apple. Called Antonovka. He grew it in his orchard, which starts behind my dad standing here. Some old apple trees, a few of them still remaining. So what Grandpa did, we used to find him in the root cellar sitting during the fall and winter and even early spring sorting the apples. He would go through the apple boxes and take out the ones that are starting to rot. In the fall, they had more apples that they could consume, so Grandpa would take them on a horse wagon to the train station. He never learned how to drive a car, so he would ride his horse to the train station, get the apples on a train, and take them all the way to St. Petersburg, Russia, to sell them in the markets. Here is my grandma sitting and smiling widely, and behind her on the table there are little tiny, crunchy, very sweet summer apples. I still hadn't figured out what variety they are. Nobody seems to know, but they used to be quite common back then in my childhood, and they would ripen early in July, and extremely tiny and sweet, and we kids loved it. I loved them. We would eat so many of them that eventually we just started throwing them at each other. They called them little grenades. I'm not sure why, but that was the name for them. Sugary apples. One of the other most famous summer apples in Lithuania was the white transparent, perhaps a Russian variety called Papirovka. Here they call the white transparent or yellow transparent. In America there are a few different variations. So they ripen very early, they have very strong honey flavor, they are almost literally transparent. You can see through the apple, very juicy. They do not last long, just a few days, but you can eat them fresh and make very awesome applesauce. So from there, from Lithuania, I ended up in the United States and eventually made my way to Prescott. And in Prescott, while hiking, I started noticing old apple trees and started wondering, where did they come from? Why are there old apple trees along the creek? So I started looking into it, and that eventually led me down the rabbit hole where I am at now, talking about the apples. Going back to Lithuania, a few more things. My grandma used to make apple cheese, which was really a cooked down applesauce squeezed into a cheesecloth and dried. So once the juices came out and it became more dry, it became really like a thick fruit leather that we would slice and eat it all winter. That was my favorite dessert by far in my childhood. My little nephew with a big basket full of apples. We have a big festival of apples in almost every town. This is my hometown. They're cooking down applesauce. They make statues of the storks as well as other apple decorations. So it's really a celebrated fruit in Lithuania. It's really just one of the few fruits that grow in that part of the world. So why would you care about apples? Well, I guess if you are here today, you are already interested in apples one way or another. And there are really a lot of reasons to be excited about apples. Apple is one of the oldest fruit. It's really about 300 million years old. Apple seeds are found in the old caves, and it goes back millions of years. It's the most ubiquitous and widespread fruit, so it grows in virtually every continent of the world. One of the longest living fruit trees. This apple tree right here is in Prescott area, and it's over 100 years old. It still produces, you can see still has greenery. It has not been pruned or watered for many, many decades, and it still produces some apples in a desert climate. So that just shows you how strong these trees are. Some of them are known to live about 200 years. Apples have more varieties than any other fruit. They're really called a promiscuous fruit because each seed produces a completely different genetic variation, which led to apples being just so varied. US really exploded apple genetics when they planted tons and tons of seedlings from 1600s to 1800s, and that just brought a whole slew of new genetic varieties into the world. So that's something to be proud of in America, is to really take credit for all the apple varieties that exist today. Apples are really healthy. Obviously, you've heard that before. And we have so many stories tied to apple trees and apples because they pretty much have the same lifespan like most people. So apple tree sometimes goes through 3 or 4 or 5 generations, and sometimes people just like remembering what apples their grandma ate and what pies they made, the best pie ever made from such and such apples. So it's a lot of nice stories related to apples. Here, just to show you how well apples are adapted. The first photograph shows Siberian Russian ladies in the 50s collecting apples in a short Siberian summer, and it almost seemingly they're picking them off the ground. The reason being that they experimented with growing apples with creeping orchards. So when the apple tree grew, they would plant them either sideways, or they would keep it very low and train the branches creep along the ground. Apples grow pretty well when the branch is horizontal, so they did have good harvests. And in the winter time, because they get covered by 3 or 4 or 5 feet of snow, the apple trees would be all under the snow, and so they would be completely protected from like -40-degree cold that they have there. So there are, of course, hardy varieties that can also survive pretty harsh climates these days, but that's another way to show how people adapted the trees and fruits to grow in certain situations. Sometimes they would also plant them in trenches, dig inside the trench and plant the trees down low. And here is an apple tree in Phoenix, in a desert area. So this is a specific apple that grows well with the low chill hours, but people also experimented with multiple apples over in the desert, and they do quite well. Let's keep going. What is your favorite apple? If you start thinking about an apple you get at the store, at the farmer's market, from an old orchard, from a friend's orchard, and you bite into it, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Is it sweet, sour, crunchy, mealy, juicy, crispy, Some apples have vanilla flavors. Some might taste almost like pineapple notes and coconutty flavor. Next time you eat an apple, try to really close your eyes and savor it and think what else does that flavor have. If you do get a good quality of apple, that can be quite interesting. Some might taste quite spicy, bitter, sour. So mainly apples are measured on 3 characteristics: how many sugars they have, what's the sweet level, sour, acids, and bitter tannins. So you want a good combination of those to make a good cider, and of course a good combination of them to actually have a good overall balanced good apple. Some apples have nutty flavors, which is russeted apples. The ones that have brown spots on them, they are not actually bad or sick, but they are specific varieties that are get very russeted, and they were my favorite in childhood too, because they just tasted really sweet and nutty. Quite a different flavor from just a shiny apple. And then fruity flavors are called by esters, and you have some earthy flavors that are caused by alcohols. So overall there's over 300 different substances in a single apple. Since I'm talking about heritage apples, so how do we define a heritage apple? Heritage apple, or heirloom apple you can call it, would be something that's basically old. And when we talk old on apples, it's mainly pre-1920s, so kind of pre-commercial era, pre-industrialization, when people still had mostly small orchards, farm orchards, and Red Delicious had not taken over the whole market. So that would be the old apple that came from before 1920s, most likely. It would be something that's rare, that's not easy to combine. There are still apples today that came from before 1920s, but they're still quite popular. They're in the top 10 or 20 list. But so heritage apple would be something that's quite rare, not widely sold or grown, and it's valuable, of course. So it has a lot of special stories tied to it, special history. This is an old remains of an old apple tree. Well, actually, it's still quite green and productive. In Fort Ross, California, where the Russian settlers came in on the coast of California and settled a big community in 1814, and they planted an apple orchard with some seedlings that they got in San Francisco, or traded, but perhaps maybe brought some things from Russia as well. That orchard still exists there. A few of the original trees remain. Some had been replanted. So if you think of how many apples you see in the store, think again. It's documented that there are anywhere between 6,000 to 20,000 apple varieties, and that's just mainly counting apples that had been mentioned in the North American region. So in 1905, USDA commissioned William Henry Regan to work on the nomenclature of the apple, who documented over 6,000 apple varieties. He tried to categorize them, shorten the names, and put them in some kind of order, because the apple varieties were getting out of control. People were naming same apple, few different names, because sometimes the same apple could be known by a different name in a different state, even though it was the same apple. So there was some work done to put them in a nomenclature book. American Pomological Society actually worked on that project since mid-1800s, but they weren't successful. So finally, in 1905, we had some literature that classified the apples. And then the most exciting work was done just a couple years ago. Mr. Dan Bussey, who is an orchardist at Seed Savers Exchange in Iowa, he went through all the documentation, including the 1905 literature, and he spent every minute of his free time over a 30-year period to put together 7 of these books, 7 volumes of the illustrated history of apples in the United States and Canada. So in these books, he names 16,000 varieties of apples. So sometimes we sit down and look through all these names in here, quite interesting. My son wanted to see if an apple was named for his name, and of course we found a few apples that was named for him. My kids even tried to look up their puppy name in here, but didn't find anything. So Dan Bussey estimates that he, of course, was not capable to put every single apple in here, so he thinks that there could be about 20,000 varieties that were named at one point or another. Here you can see a huge listing of the varieties. This book is quite interesting. It also shows some of the USDA pictures. I'll talk about them a little bit later, but it's quite a cool book to have and check out. If you think about all those varieties, what does the 20,000 really mean? If you ate one new apple variety every day, every single day of your life, it would take you about 45 years to taste each one. So that's a lot of varieties. It would take you a lifetime. Americans eat on average 126 apples a year. I think we could do better with that too. So how did we go from 20,000 to pretty much what we know today, as most people could name? If we did a test, probably 10, probably would be able to count it on their fingers. There are many reasons, of course. In 1997, I came to the United States, and I remember going to the stores at that point in the late 90s. Really, there were about 3 apples in the store: yellow, red, and green. So that was your yellow delicious, golden delicious, red delicious, and Granny Smith. I remember my host family always had Granny Smith in the house. It was just the American apple, always green, and I really didn't like it. Coming from orchards, it was my least favorite apple I've ever had. For some reason, I did not like the oily skin that was difficult to bite through, and the flavor was somewhat strange, so I really did not like. I did not even think it was worth being called an apple at that point. But so yes, it changed a little bit over the last 20 years or so. So we are perhaps heading in a better direction these days. You can see that the top 10 varieties sold in the U.S. This is based on U.S. Apple Association data, I think in 2018. 2018, we had Gala as number 1. Red Delicious is dropping down. Perhaps it's already down lower, and Honeycrisp had taken up higher spots. Oh, going back. Red Delicious, Fuji, Granny Smith, Honeycrisp, Golden Delicious, Macintosh, Pink Lady, Braeburn, and Jazz. So I think we have a couple, actually Old Apples, Braeburn, and Macintosh, that could be classified as heritage apples. Some other apples are newer apples. A lot of them are not bred in the U.S. You have Gala, which is a New Zealand apple, Fuji, Japanese apple, and Granny Smith, Australian. So a big mix, but these are the top varieties sold in the United States these days. Why did we get here to where a lot of apples are forgotten? Well, of course, industrial farming wiped out a lot of old orchards, urbanization. We have our own examples here in Sedona area and Verde Valley area. A lot of old orchards are simply gone due to urbanization. Refrigeration and transporting was a big one, because the keeping of the apple was not as important anymore, because you could just refrigerate it for a year or two. So what people kept in their cellars and was a good keeper apple, those qualities had vanished. Hard cider fell out of favor during their prohibition. So between 1920s and 30s, a lot of cider orchards were burned down. So a lot of cider apples were lost. The cider orchards were burned down, and they were replanted with eating apples, which in that era, became more like King David and Red Delicious. More profitable crops in certain areas wiped out the orchards, whether that was corn or grapes in California. A lot of old orchards are gone and replanted with grapes. And of course, focus on sweetness and appearance is much more value these days than it is any other quality. What color apples have you seen when you looked in a store? There are apples that have red flesh inside. Most people have not even seen those, but those exist. So quite almost like an art of work when you look at these apples. Quite beautiful, pink flesh, mottled flesh. These are the russeted apples I was talking about, so they look very golden, almost like gold leaf plated sometimes, or sometimes I might look quite not so golden, and people might think they're really quite ugly. I don't even know if that's an apple, but this is a knobbed russet, so it's both bumpy and russeted. And really dark, almost purple apples. Pink applesauce. So yes, you can make a pink applesauce. Those pink and red fleshed apples, of course, will make a pink applesauce. This is a gifted applesauce I received in New Mexico. But you can also make applesauce with apples that are red-skinned, like red Astrakhan apple that was grown here in Sedona area. And if you cook that down with the skin and then strain the applesauce, the redness of the skin will strain into your applesauce and will make a pink applesauce as well. So some of the old apple names are quite poetic. Some are quite funny, some are quite interesting. These days, a lot of patented apples are using names that are very catchy, brand-like, Jazz, Honeycrisp, Cosmic Crisp, Rocket, Sweet Tango. These are today's names. You can take a look at some older names. As people were on the farms, Dog Snout, there's a Hog Snout. Something that related more to that lifestyle, I assume, to name your apples. Razor Russet, Green Sleeves, Pixie Crunch, Nutting Bumpus. That's a mystery of how that apple came to be named that. There was a man named Nutting who grew the apple, but we don't know where that came from. Westfield Seek No Further. Obviously, it's telling you that's the apple. That's once you eat it, seek no further. You don't need any other apple or try anything else. So you have quite a variation in names. A few more names here. You have apples called Bottle Stopper, and they say that apple was not the best tasting apple. So perhaps they just grew that apple regardless, because it was a good bottle stopper for the cider bottles. And they just put the apple to close the bottles. Lopside. Some of them, apples were not necessarily named these beautiful, outstanding names because people just thought, let's just name them what they are. If they were lopsided, they were named lopside. Maybe an apple that tasted like a sponge, not the best, was named a sponge. On the other hand, there was melting. Very tasty dessert apple, so melted in your mouth. Honeyball, sugar and brandy, marmalade, limoncello, molasses, red cheese. This is the red cheese apple, watercolor painting by USDA commissioned artists. So Gypsy Girl, it's an old Russian variety that was sold in the streets by mainly gypsies. Sweet Russet Coat, Ma's apple. Somebody just called it Ma's apple because it was apparently so good and their mom gave it to them. Makepeace, Mayflower, Tom Blake Hard Times. Somebody was going perhaps to their hard times, or the apple was eaten in the hard times or discovered during the hard times. 2 Years Keeper. A lot of varieties were named by their properties, whether they were good keepers, whether they were sweet, whether they were striped. So early apples, June apples, things like that. So that indicates that this would keep up to 2 years in the cellars back in the day. 20 ounce, obviously a very large apple. So I wanted to mention a little bit about these watercolors, which are absolutely neat. During the turn of the century, the 20th century, USDA commissioned artists to draw watercolor apples. That's before the good days of photography. and before the days of color photography. So to really display the varieties and variations of apples, what they did is asked people all across the country to send in the apples to the USDA as specimens, and then about 10 or so artists worked hard over the period of 30, 40, 50 years to actually document those apples. So they would open, they would do the whole core of the apple, how it looked on the outside. So these are really, really neat. Each one is hand painted, hand drawn, hand documented, and each one tells you the year that it was made, who was the artist, and where the apple came from, which part of the country. USDA now houses about 7,700 of these different fruit and apple drawings and nuts. They also documented diseases, so they show watercolor drawings of when your fruit tree is not looking healthy, how the leaves will look, and things like that. Half of those drawings are apples, so you can see by the sheer number of it that apples were the prime fruit at that time. So left to right here you have an early breakfast apple, maiden blush apple, and Jersey black. Huge variations in colors. They try to capture the stripes, any russeted dots and things like that. And you can see the reddening around the skin on the Jersey black apple. These, by the way, these are available. Some of them are available online in a digital form if somebody wants to take a look and browse them. Quite interesting to look at. Now let's hop to history. Are apples native to the United States? Seeing that we had Johnny Appleseed and such a huge variety of apples makes you think that, of course, apples grow everywhere here. So yes and no. Apples are edible apples that we eat today are not native to the United States. We do have about 4 or 5 different varieties of wild crab apples. They grow mainly in the northeast, some other areas. None of the apples are native to Arizona, so Arizona did not have wild crab apples grown here. These apples, even though they were gathered by Native Americans and maybe boiled into jelly, they are not really edible. Thoreau talked about these apples in his writings, and he said they were sour enough to set a squirrel's teeth on edge and make a jay scream. So how did we go from these unpalatable little crab apples to the 20,000 varieties by 1900s? Apples originated in Central Asia. So here is Tian Shan Mountains and in the Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan area. And during the Silk Road, they traveled all the way west to modern-day Europe and out east to China. And basically, the joke goes that people along the Silk Road littered. The litter was really apple cores, apple seeds, and so the apples grew. As a new caravan traveled, they selected better apples, and whatever was the tastiest, people would keep the seeds from those apples. And so over time, you got better and better, bigger and bigger apples that were more and more edible. These are some pictures from the wild forest of Kazakhstan that still grow there. Wild, even though about 80% of them had been displaced by the cities and by development. About 20% of those forests remain. They're completely wild. They're not cultivated by people. The varieties there are amazing because they just cross-pollinate and it grows what grows. They were spread by bears and horses across all those mountains. And the capital of Kazakhstan is Almaty, which in their language means an apple. We have Robin Curry here, PhD at the Prescott College, who actually lived in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan and herself explored a lot of those native apple forests. Here's an image of the girls celebrating Apple Festival in their country, and that's really a very big deal for them and celebration of the native fruit. So here is the route, the domestication of apple. Apples became popular in Syria and then adopted by the Romans. The Romans brought apples to England. So you have a lot of Celtic culture focusing on apples there, and then apples became quite popular during the Renaissance, and all the French gardens where all the rich were able to hire a lot of gardeners and compete between the castles who is growing a better apple variety and fancier apple variety. So you have mainly your classical apples are your English varieties and French varieties that grow in slightly different climates. And so how did these apples then from Europe end up in the United States? So they traveled to the New World through two different pathways, British one and a Spanish one, just the way people traveled. So British route to America, the apples arrived on the Mayflower around 1620s. They were brought mainly as pips, seedlings, seeds, a few grafted trees that people brought maybe their favorite trees. There were some challenges with a lot of English varieties that came to the United States. A lot of them did not survive the hard winters, the winters that were much harsher in the New World, and the late spring frosts. So apples had to somewhat adapt in the New World as well, as did the Pilgrims. Cider presses at that time were ubiquitous, so of course every household had a cider press. Every village eventually had a cider mill where you would bring your apples, bushels and bushels and wagons of apples, and you get your apples pressed into the cider, and then you bring the cider back and you ferment it or drink it. Seedling orchards eventually spread westward, and out of if you think of a seedling apple, typically it's only 1 in 80,000 apples will be a tasty apple. So a lot of them might be too tannic. They're still good for cider, and really that's all they cared back then, is a good cider apple, a few eating apples perhaps. Apple orchards were basically planted before the dwellings were set, so they would plant an apple orchard and maybe put in a sauna house or a log cabin, and then eventually build the rest of the dwelling buildings. The very first American apples that came up from those seedling trees that became edible are said to be Rhode Island Greening, 1600s, Roxbury Russet, 1600s, Virginia White, 1700s, Lord Baltimore in the 1600s urged all the settlers to come in with their own kernels, apple and pear kernels, so that the cider and perry could be made from apples. Virginia pomologist James Fritz proudly pronounced apple our democratic fruit. So if you think of founding fathers, there's so many stories about apples and cider and the founding fathers. Monticello every year holds an apple festival, I believe September or October. If you go there, you still get to see the grounds and where the apples are being grown, and where Thomas Jefferson grew his apples, and to taste some of the old apple varieties. This is just a sampling of the tasting at Monticello. Thomas Jefferson grew over 1,000 fruit trees. Many of them were apples, but he mainly focused on 4 apples, 2 for cider and 2 eating apples. His 2 favorite cider apples were Hughes Crab and Talefiero, and eating apples, Newtown or Abermally Pippin, Newtown Pippin, and Aesopus Spitzenberg, absolute favorite of Thomas Jefferson, which can be used for both cider and fresh eating. Now, interestingly, 3 of these apples still survive the varieties, but Talefiero is a lost apple, so people are on a hunt to figure it out, to find out where it is, even though it was famous enough for Thomas Jefferson to grow it in his famed Monticello and promote it. It has still been lost since then. Founding fathers, William Henry Harrison, he won his 1840 election campaign, basically campaigning on log cabin and hard cider, to appeal to the common masses, to appeal to the common person that was the life back then, the log cabin and the hard cider, George Washington is said to believe that he bought the voters with the hopes of cider, and after his victory, there was a big party of drinking cider and drinking beer. As people joke, America was definitely founded on alcohol. There was a lot of cider going around back then. George Washington's Mount Vernon in 1750s. His giant estate looked like this. Over the next 2 or 3 decades, a lot of apple trees were planted in here. Benjamin Franklin talked about cider. He said it's indeed bad to eat apples. It's better to turn them into cider. Also said, he who drinks alone, let him catch his horse alone. So it was a very social drink. Drinking cider was safer than drinking water in most locations at that time. Children were mainly allowed to drink cider. It was quite a weak alcoholic drink. John Adams is said to have started every morning with a glass full of hard cider. He lived to be 90. It's still argued whether he actually drank the hard cider or apple cider vinegar. Either way, he drank some apple product at that time. Talking about cider, I'm going to jump into a little bit of a modern day thing. And cider back then and now, apples can be pressed for the fourfold reason or results. So you have your apple juice or apple cider, then you have your hard cider, which is fermented to anywhere between 5 and 8%. Really has to be legally under 8% to be considered an apple cider. And then you have apple jack, which is a hard alcohol like apple wine or brandy. And then apple cider vinegar. So when they pressed the cider, and mostly they drank the hard apple cider, which really was even given to kids and virtually anyone in the household drank that, often safer than water. And of course, if the cider went bad, then it became just apple cider vinegar, which was used for many purposes as well. Here's a picture, my display of apple products. We have our local Stoic cider that's made here in Prescott. So first anniversary and the golden russet flavors. We have some cider from New Zealand, cloudy apple cider that's not filtered, quite a good flavor. We have apple vodka from Lithuania, which is an apple flavored vodka. We have some apple syrup, which is if you take your apple cider juice and you boil it down till it's thick, you get an apple syrup, just like a maple syrup, but it's delicious to pour on pancakes, yogurt, ice cream, you name it. Sweet and tart. And then if you keep boiling your apple syrup even more, you get what sometimes is called in US as molasses, which is thicker than apple syrup. And throughout a lot of Europe, I believe it's called Appelstroop. So that's quite still popular in Dutch countries. So this is a rinsed Appelstroop, a little container of Dutch Appelstroop. So back to the founding fathers, Abraham Lincoln loved apples. He once said, "Apples agree with me. A large percent of professional men abuse their stomachs by imprudence of drinking and eating, and in that way health is injured and ruined and life is shortened." Abraham Lincoln himself never had big meals, so he was known as a snacker. He loved eating little snacks and snacked mainly on apples, nuts, and cheese. And there are at least 8 apples, perhaps even more, that actually named Lincoln. So then, as the westward expansion goes on, of course you cannot not mention the name of Johnny Chapman. So Johnny Chapman, or as we know him better as Johnny Appleseed, was born in Massachusetts right around the time of American Revolution. His mother passed when he was a little baby. His father left for the Revolutionary War, and when the father came back, he remarried and had a large family of maybe 10 more siblings. So Johnny Appleseed grew up very poor, eating just mainly apples from apple orchards, seedling apple orchards. And when he finally left his parents' household and moved on, he moved to Pennsylvania, where he planted his first orchard. out of seedlings. So he figured that he can get free apple seed by going to cider mills. Behind cider mills, there would be piles on piles of apple pulp from the pressed cider that was just filled with apple seeds. So he would just grab bagfuls of that and planted his apple orchard, which was successful. He started distributing the seed and the seedlings to other people, and so eventually he ended up traveling west to Ohio Valley, through Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, which at that time was Wild Wild West, and put out his orchards and his seedlings before people moved in there. He was quite successful and died and is buried in Indiana. So Johnny Appleseed did not graft apples. He did not propagate them by grafting. He just believed in planting seedlings. And doing that, he really introduced an amazing variety into the genetics of U.S. apples. Here is another person who took a slightly different route a little bit later. It's Henderson Luling, a Quaker from Iowa who had a successful nursery already in Iowa in 1840s. He decided to move to West Coast and moved to Oregon in 1840s. So he set out with his 7 children, a pregnant wife, and 7 wagons across the United States out west. He made 2 double-sized wagons and filled them with dirt and soil and planted them full of 700 seedling trees. So those 2 wagons were extremely heavy, pulled by oxen, and contained 700 seedling trees. He believed that he could transfer his success and his nursery out to the West Coast. They traveled for about 7 months across the United States. Lots of adventure there. They were in a wagon train and could not keep up going fast enough with those heavy wagons. So the wagon train left them and said, "You guys will have to go by yourselves. We will not travel with you and protect you." And at that time, traveling across was not the safest thing to do by yourself. So at one point, Native Americans did ambush their caravan, and as the story goes, is as soon as they saw the green apple seedlings in the wagon, they thought that Lulings were sent from the higher spirits and they were doing a good work. So Native Americans did not bother their caravans. Some say that the story goes that they actually escorted them all the way to Oregon, protecting them on the way. He did lose one of the wagons that overturned, I think, on the way there. So he did lose about 350 of those seedlings. But eventually when they got to Oregon, they planted out the 350 seedlings, and just a few years from then, his orchard started producing, and he established he was the pioneer of the Oregon orchard growing business. Later on, he moved to California and did pretty much the same. So that was the westward route, basically going from England, and then we have a second route to America, which was the Spanish. So you have Jesuits and others traveling from Mexico City up to the Santa Fe Trail, into the Santa Fe. So into the old settlements of Santa Fe, you already have apple trees mentioned in 1630s. So right around the same time frame as the East Coast, and trees were planted where chill was sufficient, so in mountainous areas. Santa Fe Trail Mormons brought the lots of orchards in the southwest to the southwest as well, Utah, Northern California. As the Santa Fe Trail connected Missouri River there to the Santa Fe, actually to the El Camino Trail, you have then more apples coming in that direction as well. Fruit trees and seeds were traded with Native Americans. A lot of peach orchards were planted on the Native American lands at that time. Apples were not as adapted to those areas as peaches. And then you have the beginnings of all the mining towns out west. So wherever you had a mining town, apples followed pretty much quickly. And that's what we have happening here in Prescott, being a mining town. There is a quick snapshot going a little bit forward, so 1909, 1910. So from that age to 1910, we're jumping in, but you can see that mountain states, the data from 1910 Horticulture Encyclopedia says that in mountain states, the leader is Colorado with 3.6 million apple trees. I don't know how they counted each apple tree, but that's the estimate of 3.6 million in Colorado, 2.5 million Idaho, 2 million Montana, 1.5 New Mexico. Utah is close behind New Mexico. And Arizona, Nevada, Wyoming were not as big on apple growers, obviously due to elevation and the climate, but they don't list it in millions, but it said about 1,000 acres in Arizona at that time were covered with apple orchards. Here's a picture of a street vendor just a couple years ago in southern Colorado, Durango. They still selling on the street apples picked from many old orchards, and you can see the colors and the variety. Arizona production of 1909 was 154,000 bushels, valued at $241,000. That's all orchard fruits. Apples contributed half of this quantity. So you can see that apples were the biggest producer in 1909 in Arizona. So apples in Arizona. Almost everybody in Phoenix Valley knows about Reed's Ranch. Hikers. It's a Superstition Mountains, a really popular place amongst the hikers to go to. Has a great history, and in the fall, this is how it looks. A gentleman took a picture of the fallen apples a couple years ago at Reed's Ranch. Now these are replanted apples, they're not original from Elijah Reeves from 1870s, but that's where his original orchard was when he moved to the mountains of Arizona and lived there as a loner and produced a huge garden and orchard in the mountains to be sold to all different mining towns all around there. Bradshaw Mountains around Prescott have lots and lots and lots and lots of hidden old apple orchards. Southeastern Arizona, you have some little apple orchards in Catalina Mountains. Lots of apple growing around Payson, Christopher Creek, White Mountain areas. So anywhere elevation is 3,000 feet and higher, 3,000 to 8,000 feet, anywhere in between, there is apples growing. Sedona, of course, apple growing capital of Arizona. Oak Creek area, due to the availability of water, is very well known for commercial apple growing. Three ranches, Walter Jordan, Frank Pendley, and Schneebly's were notable growing later on. Verde Valley had a lot of orchards in the early years, which later seem to have vanished. So now we're zooming in into apples in Prescott specifically and Yavapai County. Here is an apple blossom trail in Prescott, Arizona with a blooming apple tree in the background. So we had a USDA experimental station here in Prescott, which was about 100 acres just north of Prescott City. And it was a desert station where they tried to experiment growing fruits and vegetables without irrigation and see how they do in growing in a desert climate. And it's said to have grown some King David, Rome Beauty, White Winter Pearmain, Arkansas Black, and Gravenstein apples by 1912. I don't believe any of those apples from the USDA station had survived there. Where did people get the apples back then? Well, nurseries were already pretty widely available. You could order apples through the catalogs. Stark Brothers Nursery already had 50 varieties available for order. In 1867, Robert Prince Nursery out east had already 350 grafted apple varieties available in their catalog in 1845. So Prescott got established as a city in 1864. I found this article in 1869 complaining that not enough people are growing apples. So article says, a wagon load of very poor apples was brought here from San Bernardino, California this week. They are being sold for 40 cents a pound and are dear at that price. Our people made a grand mistake in not procuring and setting out fruit trees in '64 after permanent settlements had been made here. Had they done so, they would not now have to pay 40 cents for the meanest sour apples we have ever tasted of. So not really happy with California, expensive apples. Weekly Miner is mentioning that everybody should try growing their own apples, but in reality people were already putting out the apple orchards. So by the early 1870s, first homesteads are planted and orchards are being planted along the creeks to take advantage of irrigation. Here are a couple earliest mentions of the plantings. 1868 article already mentions Point of Rocks, that thousands of the fruit trees were planted at the Point of Rocks, which is current Dells. Apples are mentioned at the Quartz Mountain Sawmill, apples and peach trees. Out in Walnut Grove, there were peaches. Over 2,000 peach trees were planted there. Peaches were looking well. Mr. Lamberson's fine orchard of over 2,000 trees at Walnut Grove will this year, it is said, yield several wagon loads of fruit. That's 1871. And then the '68 article mentions strolling around the town of Prescott, viewing tastefully arranged gardens adjoining the dwellings of our citizens. Were plants and flowers in every variety, and then it goes on to talk about some apple tree orchards. A great book by Alvina Potter, published in 1964. It documents 100 years of many lives of the Lynx Creek. So the community of Walker and Lynx Creek, and a lot of apples are mentioned there. So that was a big mining community in Prescott area. And she says that the Boblet family, who settled at Lynx Creek in 1875, the head of the family, on the level ground of one side of the creek, he built a house, and on the other side, he planted 75 fruit trees they had ordered by catalog. Because of his knowledge of how to prepare the ground for planting, they enjoyed the best fruit in the country. Well, people always said it was the best fruit in the country, so they probably exaggerate a little bit, but they definitely were proud, obviously, of their apple trees. And interestingly, ordered by catalog. So very first commercial, so to speak, apple orchard that sold apples to the people of Prescott is Claude Orchard, and that was the orchard at Point of Rocks in the Dells. In 1897, this is quite funny because Prescott Courier reports, Claude is preparing to start a store on the south side of the plaza for the sale of the products of his orchards. He says that Prescott has grown so large that he can no longer drive in from his ranch and make the rounds of the city in one day. So that just tells you that before he started his own little apple stand or apple store, he was taking the orders and making the rounds in the cart or in the city to deliver the apples to all the houses in Prescott. And so the articles here from the Weekly Journal Miner talk about, it says, I had opened my fruit stand at the old place, 122 North Montezuma Street, in the basement, and sell apples by the box, barrel, or pound from 3 to 5 cents. Cider for mince meat. Pure homemade apple butter in cans. Orders of 25 cents or more are delivered. And the telephone number 46 Claude. Claude's apples from Claude's celebrated Point of Rocks orchard can be had at his store on Montezuma Street next door to Brinkmeyer's Hotel at retail at 4 cents a pound or $1.50 a box. Now it's time to lay in your supply of apples for the winter. Cool history. And here is the actual photograph of the Claude's orchard. A lady is picking apples, what to me looks like perhaps red colored apples. They look quite dark in the picture and quite a good size. If you take a look at relationship to the bucket and the apples, I mean, she fills the bucket with just a few apples. Looks like he has the trees so bending down with the apple crop that maybe they use the support to support the branches from breaking. Pretty good sized trees, already look like established trees in here. And the Claude owned that orchard from 1877 to 1908, his death in 1908, and then it was sold to Bianconi family. So here's another picture from Claude orchard. A lady is walking amongst the trees that are in blossom, and you can see the size of the trees. They were truly full-size trees, 30, 35, 40 feet up in the air. So here's another photograph, a little bit blurry, but this is a Charlotte Hall orchard. So it's an orchard ranch where Charlotte Hall lived on Lower Lynx Creek, which is now Dewey, along the creek. And if I am seeing right in this picture, you have fruit trees in the back of those gentlemen who are working, looking, maybe harvesting, because they have a horse sled pulled and their boxes of either apples or fruit trees, maybe pumpkins, potatoes. There's a harvest, full of harvest in here. So they definitely grew their own apples as well. So we're moving into the 80s and 90s, the end of the century here. And a few other places to mention is a big orchard of Haskell and Kerwagon was grown near Jerome, Verde Valley area. And that existed for maybe 30 or 40 years. Apple trees were all in little orchards along all different creeks. You have Big Bug Creek and lots of little apple orchards there, Walnut Creek, Granite Creek, Aspen Creek, Turkey Creek, you name it. All the creeks around Prescott where people settled, they used that water for irrigation. Banner Creek right here in Prescott. Louis Dendria Ranch on Turkey Creek out by Poland, what is now Breezy Pines, was established in 1870s, 1890s. And this is an actual still standing old apple tree at Dendria Ranch. It's really, really, truly gigantic. It's possibly an original tree from his 1870s or end of the century plantings. Yavapai apples won a lot of horticultural awards at that time. This one mentions Claude and 4 other growers of Yavapai County winning diplomas for their apples at the Albuquerque Fair of 1888. Raised and contributed by Claude of Prescott, Arizona, 1 crate of Champion Quinces, 1 crate of sweet seedling apples, which could be anything, any of his seedling, 1 crate of Nonsuch apples, that was an actual name of the apple, 1 crate of Spitzenberg apples, 1 crate of Permain, they shortened the names, and 1 crate of Rhode Island Greening apples, 1 crate of Fall Repet apples, 1 crate of Klaus cooking apples. He simply called them, I guess, his favorite cooking, and he just named them, who knows what they were actually, what variety, and 1 crate of Smith cider apples, Russian crab apples, diploma each. So it's neat because you can get some of those varieties from the old newspapers and magazines still named in there. So now we're turning the century, 1900s. This is right the time when USDA commissioned all those people to draw do the apple watercolors, and it was really apples booming, and there was such a huge interest in apple trees and old varieties and documenting the apples all around, all in the country. So in Prescott, that was truly a golden age of apple, the beginning of the 20th century. Believe it or not, there were more apple trees than there were people. Prescott had no more than 5,000 people in 1905, somewhere right around 5,000 in the whole Prescott area. And it definitely had more apple trees. There were single orchards that even had more than 5,000 apple trees each. Again, I mentioned the USDA experimental station was here in Prescott at that time. The apples from here were exported worldwide. There were many awards and exhibits. The sun was good here for ripening apples. And in the beginning, there was no diseases. There's no fungus in this area due to the dryness. There was no pests, no codling moth even in the beginning, even though at this time it started moving in here in the area. So yavapai apples are shipped to Europe. Prescott apples grown in the early 1900s. So one of the biggest orchards that had over 5,000 apple trees was grown, is said to be biggest in Arizona, was grown here near Prescott. It's a Fair Oaks orchard. In fact, the first truck ever to drive into Prescott brought in 3,000 pounds of Fair Oak apples in 1912. It would require the new vehicle 45 round trips to bring 10,000 boxes of apples into town. The truck was a Canadian-built 50 horsepower shaft that could reach 20 miles per hour when fully loaded with 2 tons of cargo. From Prescott AZ history blog by Drew Desmond. I like the description of the 45 round trips to get into town with the apples. So apples, here's another article from Weekly Journal Miner that mentions the owners, Mouse and Stewart, of this valuable property that they shipped to the fair, 200 boxes of different varieties, 200 gallons of apple cider vinegar, which will be distributed gratuitously to those who call at their booth in the Yavapai exhibit. We can look a little bit more mentions of Fair Orchards apple trees here. Interestingly, there is no big creeks in that area where the orchard is grown, so I'm not sure how it was irrigated, whether it was drawn out from the well and watered. That's still a mystery how they irrigated that giant orchard, but here are a few more mentions of the shipments, 1911, 1913, 1914, so the beginning of the century. Stewart has arrived from Phoenix and leaves today for Fair Oaks, where packing begins tomorrow of the big apple crop of the firm of Mouse and Stewart. The number of boxes is estimated at 8,000 to 10,000, the largest to the credit of this orchard. The entire crop has been purchased by Walter Hill of Phoenix and will be loaded on the cars at Skull Valley. So they would bring those apples from Fair Oaks Orchard, and if you don't know where Fair Oaks is, it's between Williamson Valley and Skull Valley. If you take Williamson Valley Road out, there is a Fair Oaks Road, and you have to wind down that road to get where that old orchard once stood. Now it's split up amongst multiple properties. As far as I know, none of those original, or almost none of the original apple trees survive in that area, but there are still big orchards there, and a lot of those trees survived. A lot of the trees had been replanted, and a lot of those apples are being used to press our local Stoic apple cider. So when you taste the Stoic cider, you are tasting history of some of the Fair Oaks orchard apples. So let's see if anything is worth mentioning here. 750 boxes loaded on the cars to Phoenix Market. Again, it was very convenient. They were using that train line between here, Skull Valley, and Phoenix and Prescott to bring those apples in and then distribute them out to other cities. Requests have come in from as far north as Oregon, while in eastern markets the yield has commanded a good figure. The drain has been so steady that even at this early date the supply is restricted, that local consumers may be favored. They're talking that they just don't have enough apples to fill all the orders, and over 5,000 trees comprise this orchard. Highest rank in number in the Southwest under individual ownership in the Southwest. So another interesting article of Prescott apples, talking about apples, was published in 1919 by Charlotte Hall herself. And since they were growing apples at their property, she did quite an interesting article here talking about challenges and growing apple orchards and other things. And she mentions talking to the gentleman who was traveling through the area, looking at the mines of Prescott and the apple orchards of Prescott. And this gentleman is quoted to have said, "You people will all be talking apples as well as mines. In a few years more, you will eat and sleep and dream apples as they do in the Hood River region of the Ozarks. You will be taking visitors out to see the orchards as well as mines by the time I come again. I've bought just enough Yavapai copper property this trip to give me an excuse to come back and watch the apple orchards grow." He was claiming that he traveled the world, traveled Europe, traveled the Ozarks, Oregon and Washington, and that he saw our Prescott apples comparable to all of those famous orchards. Another funny thing in the article is that Charlotte Hall herself says that a lot of people just would not believe that apples can grow here because of the dryness. She said when she was setting out the trees, fruit trees and apple trees on her orchard, people would drive by in the wagons and shake their heads. And she says this old man leaned off his wagon seat and yelled out to us, you all will sure raise hell with fruit on that dry land." So yeah, they had a lot of skeptics, non-believers. Believe it or not, where the current day orchard ranch is, I heard that no trees are surviving, but maybe 5 or 10 years back, actually there were still old pear trees where that park is that now became a settlement. On that land there were still pear trees surviving just maybe a decade ago. So this is an unknown Prescott orchard. Thanks to Charlotte Hall Museum Library, you can see that it's very well taken care of. Apple trees are all whitewashed, or the fruit trees are all whitewashed. I can't quite actually tell what trees they are, but pretty giant orchard that might well be fair oaks or some other one, but really, really giant, planted in rows. So from my research, going through all of these papers, Prescott apples that were grown here, the ones that are mentioned in Yavapai County, it's a huge list. This is just a partial list, but you can see that there were quite a few. A lot of them still are in existence, and you can get them: Arkansas Black, Red Astrakhan, Northern Spine. Pretty typical for that growing period, and it seems like most likely people got them from the catalog, from the nurseries. My most exciting find was lowland raspberry, sometimes called liveland raspberry. But that's a summer apple that actually originates in the area of Lithuania by the Baltic Sea, where I come from. So that apple eventually traveled to US by going through Europe and arriving here. So it's kind of neat to find it growing in Prescott area as well. An interesting article from 1909 mentions Prescott apple sent as a present to President Taft. So I just always joke about this, and I say perhaps that was a bribe to President Taft to get Arizona into the statehood, signed into a statehood, as that happened a few years later. And so the article says that the largest apple ever grown in Arizona and Yavapai County to be presented to President Taft. President's friend John Hayes Hammond, during his brief visit here, saw the big apple and he marveled at its size. "It beats anything I ever saw at any country fair in Missouri, Iowa, New York, or any of the apple-raising states to the east," he said. So it was not long before he had entered into negotiation. He wished to present the apple to the President Taft to show the chief executive what Arizona can produce. So he traveled with that apple, carefully wrapped in his suitcase, to meet up with the president in Utah. And the apple was wrapped in large letters. In the large letters, the sign was "Handle with care." So that's a pretty neat story. That came from the John Bianconi orchard, which he took over from Claude in 1908. So shortly after that, Bianconi's managed the orchard, which eventually became largest peach orchard in the state. But at this point, he still grew a lot of apples, so he presented the giant apple to President Taft. Oh, and this is an old apple tree in Prescott area that has gigantic apple blossoms. So probably the biggest apple blossoms I had ever seen. They're literally very, very big. Here is the Bianconi orchard, which they managed from 1908 to 1936, where they had some kind of bad peach disease, peach mosaic, and they had to unfortunately kill most of their peach trees. But this is in the early days of the orchard, and you can see the gentleman are picking some apples off the apple tree. Here's another photograph of the fruit trees at the orchard. And here's a postcard showing the irrigation. So it's believed that it's from Willow Creek, the plume that they build. I think you can still find the remains of that if you hike around Willow or Watson Lakes. You can still see the remains of the irrigation that's left, but I'm not sure of the year of this. But it's obviously took a lot of work to just build the irrigation for those giant orchards. Here is another high praise for our Prescott apples in 1913. So this is quite interesting. A professor from Washington, Professor Lawrence, a horticulturalist at the University of Arizona, Tucson, was a visitor at the Chamber of Commerce yesterday. He's been in Arizona only 2 weeks and is traveling northern Arizona to study the orchard outlook. And so he has been 11 years with the State College of Washington, and so he's really horticultural guy comparing orchards of the Washington State and Arizona. And so it's quite interesting because what he says is the general quality of all the varieties I have come in contact with is exceptionally good. The Jonathan is perhaps your leading apple, with arome beauty, wealthy band-aids, and delicious, noteworthy for their adaptability here. He's saying that a lot of apples that seem to be mediocre in Oregon, they have considerable character here. So that brings us to the point where same apple grown in different regions can be quite different. Some of them might not taste good in one region, but they really taste great in another. He talks about the apple industry in Yavapai County having a great success for the future. Your orchards are practically free from fungus and diseases, and on he goes. Funnily, he says, it is difficult to compare your old and indifferently cared for orchards with the well-kept orchards of Oregon and Washington. I see indications everywhere that the varieties that are adapted to this county will produce as heavy and fine crops as elsewhere if given equal care. So it seems like people maybe were not doing as good of a care on our orchards here as they were doing in very productive orchards in Washington. So with all that praise and awards and the winning apples and apples for the president, was it easy to grow? It's never been really easy for people to grow apples here. Lots of challenges. I said early frosts, should really say late frosts. Late frosts are one of the biggest challenges we have here, as any one of you know who grows apples. So late frost is an issue. Here you can see an image from Sedona Heritage Museum. It's of the smudge pots. So people used smudge pots in their orchards. especially I've seen them in Sedona, but they were all around here in Prescott as well. So to keep the orchards warm on the cold nights, and they describes here at the Walter Jordan's place, the sled was pulled by a Caterpillar tractor. This is already in the 1950s. But once placed, the dampers were opened and cleaned, and then each pot was topped off with diesel fuel. When the signal was given, the workers raced through the trees with a torch. It wasn't the safest practice, of course. That probably wouldn't be really cool these days with fire danger, but that's what they did to try to prevent the blossoms from freezing. We, of course, have drought, long drought periods where the irrigation can become a problem and you lose some apple trees. And then you have floods. Sometimes we get those crazy washing floods. For example, really bad flood hit the area in 1907 around Dewey area. Reports coming from the Agua Fria River, Agua Fria country, indicate that the storm which visited that section Tuesday was the most destructive in the history of that part of the county since its first settlement. In its fury, the flood did many thousands of dollars worth of damage in carrying away railroad bridges, washing away farms, houses, orchards, and mining camps. Lessard's Alpha Farm and Orchard, which he spent the past 15 years in improving, and which was considered the most valuable place on the Agua Fria River, was entirely washed away by the waters, which almost reached his house and barns. So they said that the water reached 15 feet in height, so the wall of 15 feet of water just came and washed everything away. That was always a balancing challenge, to plant the trees where there is enough water near the creek or the lower land where the trees can actually hook into the creek bed, and at the same time to not have them then wash away during when we get the really crazy monsoon storms and floods. So we're still having that challenge if we want to replant some of those old orchards. Then we move into the, so to speak, more modern day area, which is becoming more commercialized. So we have the prohibition in Arizona from 1915, earlier than federal prohibition, to 1933. So that lasted 18 long years, and basically, apple production dwindled at that time. Then you have the Depression of the 1930s, which then led to the decline of all the mining towns and people moving out, and a lot of those orchards are being abandoned. We did have the CCC and WPA camps in the 30s and 40s, and some of them had camps out in the woods on a more mountainous locations, and they did plant some apple orchards there as they were camping. You can still find a few in the area. We have more tourism moving in the 40s and 50s, so you have the tourist camps and cabins built out. One sample of those orchards is like White Spar Orchard out on White Spar Road, and that's where you have a little orchard that still remains from that era, from the camping cabins. And apple trees were planted around it. And then Sedona at that time was booming with the commercial orchard production. By this time the roads were paved and it was easier to get them out of the remote Sedona location into the Phoenix area or Flagstaff to sell the apples. So they saw more of a production. But of course now you're having fewer varieties. So some of these old apple trees are starting to fall down. I'll just quickly mention a few things about Sedona area. Sedona straddles both Yavapai and Coconino counties, so it's in both counties, and apple trees were growing really widely there. I was told by a Sedona old-timer that all from the lower Oak Creek up to the higher Oak Creek, almost to the canyon area, there were apple orchards, one after another, after another, after another. On the lower Oak Creek, there was more peach orchards, but usually mixed, but more peaches were grown, and up higher, more apples were grown. So here's a photograph of Dumas family, Dumas Ranch, around 1930s, which is currently a Crescent Moon Ranch. So that area was owned by a couple different families, and there was a lot of apple orcharding going on there. And they are pressing apple cider press, if you can see. And they're pressing cider here. They pressed both blackberries of the area and apples. Walter Jordan Ranch, the biggest ranch of Sedona, 1930s. So this is the view, aerial view, which is pretty cool, and you can see the size of it. So it's all been developed over. I don't have much remaining. Here is a baby Fred Shurman with his father in 1928, when this little guy grew up. That's sitting, I think you can see little apple or little fruit trees in the background of the horse there. But when he grew up, he ran one of the Sedona's largest orchards, competing with Pendley's and the Jordans. This is an interesting photograph. Ira Smith is picking fruit. He's picking peaches actually, but it's still funny because it's picking the cowboy style. So he's sitting on his horseback, he's picking the peach fruit off the tree. That's one way to reach it. And he has a canvas bag on his shoulder. The bag had an opening on the bottom so they can gently empty out the fruit that they pick. Sedona Red Rock fruit here, the fancy Red Rock decorations, and there's Sedona images here, and display of colorful apples. There is some kind of letters written out in different colors here, but I can't make it out. But this is a fruit display at the Yavapai County Fair of the 1930s. Tons and tons of apples. Apple sorting machine at Walter Jordan's ranch in 1948. So you can still visit the Sedona Heritage Museum and learn all that history of the Jordan's ranch. And then at the Slide Rock State Park, you can see the Pendley's ranch and the apple shed, packing shed, and the sorting machines. Quite big apples. And they used to hire seasonal workers from the area to do the work. You can see there's people of various ages working together here. Oh, at one point, Jordans were the biggest employer, believe it or not, in Sedona area with the apple ranch. Still standing. So are any of this school history still remaining? A few trees are. They are not in the best shape or form. Luckily, the ones that were not in the centers of towns, that were not developed over with neighborhoods and streets and paved over, the ones that were out in the middle of nowhere or abandoned mining camps, a few of them survive, which is really neat, and you can find them out there. This is one of the old Prescott apple trees, still standing barely, but still hanging on. And so now we have, moving into 2000s, into the 21st century, we have some good news. We have apple revival all across the country, but also in our own little area in Prescott. So we have our own cider company here, Stoic Cider, which is Kanan Roudston, his brother Cody, and their mom Rebecca. They're sorting through these apples to be pressed into cider. So if you haven't tried Stoic Cider, that's our own local history. I will talk about Kanan in a few minutes, but what else is happening? Interest in heirloom apples and heritage apples is coming back. People want to know more, want to know the history. Backyard gardeners becoming more popular. People want to grow their own fruit in the backyard, especially now with all the pandemic going on. And then we have slow food. We have a great slow food chapter here in Prescott, so we're promoting talks. They had a talk on apples recently, and lots of excitement about local food. So these are little apple seedlings and planted by Kanan and his family, and you can see a variety of leaves, so that shows you just variation. Red leaves might indicate the red-fleshed apples or darker apples. Even apple wood of those apples is sometimes tinged with red and pink. So can you plant an apple from seed like they did? They're planting seedlings because they have a cidery. So they really don't care. They want a huge variation of flavors. But if you plant an apple from a seed from your favorite apple, you might be surprised. So if you take your big red favorite apple, let's say you love Honeycrisp, you grab a Honeycrisp from the store and you eat it, and then you excitedly save the seed and you're thinking, I'll just plant this Honeycrisp seed and then in a few years I'll have my own Honeycrisps. Well, not so much, because that Honeycrisp apple came from two parents. So this will be your seed that came out from Honeycrisp. But so one parent was a Honeycrisp, but you have no clue what the other parent is. So apples are typically not self-fertile. They need another pollinator. So if you do that, you will end up, and it's an incredible variation of genes. It could be just any apple that was here, which could have come with another two any apples, and then you could end up, well, planting your red apple seedling, you could end up with tiny sour green apple, you could end up with mushy yellow apple, you could end up with just about anything. It's absolute lottery. It's just, you have as much chance of having a really good tasty apple as you would have winning a lottery ticket. So that's why apples are mainly propagated by grafting these days. Seedlings are coming back, and they're called pippins. So they're mainly coming back for cider, because cider industry is booming and people want to experiment, see what's going to come out from seed. So you can still do seedlings. You can still plant your own seed, and you could use that seedling as a rootstock. But you most likely will have to graft a piece of known apple onto the piece of that rootstock. So the stalks, that what are the pluses and minuses of growing apples from seed, cutting, or grafted. I'll briefly just mention grafting here in a couple slides. So grafting is a process of surgically connecting one piece of tree to another piece. This shows a whip and tongue, so-called whip and tongue apple graft, and it healed, and you just barely see the scar, and it basically grows as one single fruit tree. So when you go to Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever you buy your fruit tree, all of those trees are grafted trees. They used one variety for rootstock to determine the size of it, pest resistance, disease resistance, and then they grafted on something edible or that people like. Why is grafting exciting? To me, it's super exciting. You might say, well, why worry about it? Well, you can graft multiple apple varieties on one tree, which is neat. This might encourage them to cross-pollinate. You might have different staggered blooming times, so you're more likely to get more apples on your tree. If you have limited space in your backyard, you might want to do that. So you can make an apple tree with different colors. You're using benefits of the rootstock, the original rootstock, so you can have a dwarfing rootstock or a full-size rootstock, or one that does good in Arizona in a drought, that is very hardy, that doesn't fall over. So you're using the benefits of that specific rootstock, but that rootstock came from some apple that was maybe not very tasty. So once you graft on the top of the apple that's tasty, now you're using benefits of both the taste, flavor, and the rootstock. And why else is grafting is exciting? Considering all the history of heritage apples is here. I like this little quote from John Bunker in this book, in the foreword of this encyclopedia. John Bunker writes, "Tracking down, identifying, and preserving our agricultural heritage is a bit like running a relay race. The baton is the fruit tree twig called a scion." So that's the piece of that wood that you're using for grafting. "The trees are gifts to us from anonymous grafters of the past. We snip a small piece from their tree, graft it into a young tree, and then we pass it on to the future. In doing so, the baton is passed from the generation to generation." So when people talk about Bramley's seedling tree, somewhere in England there's a tree that's like 200 years old that came initially from a seedling, but then somebody liked the flavor so much they took a little cutting off of it, distributed somewhere else. Somebody grew it from that cutting, distributed somewhere else, since they took it from that cutting. Some of these apples, that same little material passed over generation to generation to generation, now traveled to where we are at now. So your little, you know, delicious apple or golden delicious can be traced back to one single tree that, you know, it initially came from. It's pretty neat when I think about it. So can you graft anything onto anything? You can't really graft an apple onto a cottonwood tree or a maple or something. Apples go with apples. So the rootstock, the tree you're grafting on, and the scion, which is the piece you're grafting onto the rootstock, are usually just different varieties of the same species, like apple on apple. Sometimes with different fruit trees, like stone fruit, you can do same genus, different species on the same genus. The grafting history is nothing new. It's nothing scary and new and GMO related. It goes really back long time ago, and obviously people noticed somewhere in the nature that when tree branches rub together, they fuse together, so they heal together, and you know they can grow like that. So people had been grafting trees for forever. Grafting basics, it's really just quite simple, of connecting the two tissues together, connecting them in, that they will have the most surface area for the cambium layers to connect. And cambium layer is like the thin layer right under the skin where the sap flows through back and forth. You have to keep it clean, all your tools clean, and you wrap the scion area to keep it moist, and then you unwrap it once it's healed. There's a couple styles of grafting, which shows you here. You can do a cleft graft, whip and tongue, which I typically use, chip budding or T-budding. So a single little bud of a tree can produce a whole new tree, and that's how many of the nursery trees are produced. All you need to take is a tiny little bud of one tree, insert it in the bark section of another tree, and this will grow out a new branch and a new tree. This main part is eventually cut down. If you are interested to learn more about grafting, look for our local grafting workshops here and scion exchanges. So each spring, somebody in Prescott area holds a local grafting workshop where you can come and learn how to graft yourself. And we do scion exchanges where people actually will swap the scion wood, so you can go back home with a few different varieties and graft them onto your trees. You can also join Arizona Fruit Tree Scion Exchange group, which me and my partner run on Facebook. So we have people from all around Arizona swapping scions, scion wood for all different trees, including apples. Or you can join North American Scion Exchange group, which is a big national group on Facebook. And as the springtime approaches, there is a lot of activity there. People discuss what tools to use, the grafting tape, exchanging scions. Some people offer scions for sale at a minimum amount. Some you exchange and ship to different locations. So quite fun stuff if you're interested. So why are these varieties so important? Why are we talking about them? Why is it important to keep those old apples? Well, they're pretty neat because you have so many different eating qualities of apples. Some are really good fresh eating, and most people are focusing on fresh eating these days because who wants to be cooking down and drying the apples? And not a lot of that is being done anymore. But really, not all apples will bake well. If you want a good apple pie, you need to know which variety to use. If you want a really delicious applesauce, you can't make it with just a plain dessert apple that might not cook down really well into an applesauce. So you had, in the old days, you had varieties of apple butter and varieties and baking varieties and drying and frying. You had pickling apples, the ones that people pickled actually, that maybe weren't the best when they were fresh and they were maybe too tart or too tannicky. Apples that stored long. And then I mentioned old person's apple. Well, what is an old person's apple? So a lot of people don't like soft apples these days anymore. Sometimes there were apples so mushy that that a lot of people would just throw them away these days and dismiss it. But for an old person back in the day, was a perfect eating apples because the teeth are hurting, maybe the dentures are falling out, and so you want a soft eating apple. You can just bite into it without even really cutting it up, and it doesn't hurt your mouth. Ripening times are important, so you want your staggered apples, that you have some apples ripening end of June, then in July, then August. You want the mid-season and late-season apples. You want apples that, you know, hang while it's still freezing outside, and they get yummier and sweeter after the first frost, and then you pick them and then you store them, you know, till the next spring. So that used to be all very important. Now that we have apples brought from all over the world, we have New Zealand apples, South American apples when it's springtime here and it's fall time there, so we have all these imports that our own ripening times are not really that relevant. But if you're going to grow in your backyard, you want to look at these things. Disease resistance, of course, the more varieties you have, the more chance you have for disease resistance. Cold tolerance, chill hours, late blooming. So a lot of varieties that might do well here in Prescott with very late and unpredictable frosts that we have, or even more so in Flagstaff area, at even higher elevations. We want the apples that bloom out really, really late, that they stay dormant for a long time. You don't want to plant golden Dorsets or Annas or something that they just bloom out in February as soon as it gets a warmer day, thinking that it reaches its own 200 chill hours, and it's blooming and then it gets frozen. So we have specific recommendations for apples, like Rawls Janet does well here. Apples that bloom really late. So biodiversity, as I mentioned, assures better survival, resistance to pests and disease. A lot of southern apples saw a lot of interest lately, and as Mr. Lee Calhoun, who passed away recently, who was a key person researching southern apples, mentioned, he said that it's important to know these southern varieties and preserve them, because as the climate is changing and everything is moving upwards, you might need to plant those southern varieties that do in the warmer climates pretty well. You might want to plant them in more of a northern climates as the weather is warming up. Obviously, loss of biodiversity destroys our relationship to food. If we don't know what those apples were or how they look, we're not as interested perhaps in making those special foods and cooking them down to apple cheese or apple molasses. People's personal stories and heritage are being lost if we lose those apples. And these local apples adapt to the soils. So we know that the apples that are doing well and had survived in Prescott here without any care for 120 years, we can tell that they're good survivors. They're perhaps exhibiting some kind of feature in them that will allow them, if we propagate that same variety back into our backyards, that apple will do well even if we forget to water it. So is everything lost? Not really. A lot of people are working preserving these apples. This is a huge list, and I just barely scratched the surface, but I'm mentioning a few people who have done so much work before I looked into any of this for the last 30 and 50 years into the old apples. So some names worth mentioning: Kanan Roudston, so our own Prescott, Arizona person, and I'll talk about him in a second. Jolene Schaefer and Raphael, Kanan's sister, both in Skull Valley. Here, Skull Valley, Arizona, have large orchards where they grow apples among other fruit trees, and they are growing a lot of heirloom old apple varieties. Montezuma Orchard Restoration Project in Colorado, focusing on southwestern Colorado apples. I'll touch a little bit on them again in the next slide. Gordon Tooley in New Mexico. Here's Mr. Gordon Tooley with the snowshoes at his snowy orchard in the northern New Mexico. I visited him a couple years ago, and we walked with snowshoes through his orchard. And he is a nursery that sells to the local area. He focuses specifically on apple varieties that do well in the Southwest, that do well in New Mexico. And a lot of old orchards are being replanted with a little seedling, with little young trees from his orchard. Boundary County Orchard Restoration Project, Kasimir Holeski from Idaho. We swapped many scions with him over the last couple of years. He does the same work and detecting old apples from the old orchards and taking cuttings and restoring them back in Idaho. And if you remember, Colorado and Idaho were the top growers of the large orchards at that time in 1910. Temperate Orchard Conservancy Project, original Nick Botner's orchard, where he claimed he had close to maybe 6,000 varieties, the biggest private apple collection in the world. Nick Botner passed away this year, unfortunately, at a very, very old age. But people at the Temperate Orchard Conservancy had cloned every one of his apples and propagated them so that genetic material is preserved. Fedco Trees and John Bunker in Maine. John Bunker's book just came out, Apples and the Art of Detection. An absolutely awesome book. He goes over all his 30 plus years of detecting old Maine apples and figuring out what they are and bringing them back to life. So very, very interesting book with tons of photographs. If anyone is interested in detective history and apple detection, that's definitely a book to check out. Lost Apple Project in Washington, David Bescofter, he's probably more well known from the mainstream media these days, bringing some Washington apples back to life. Lee Calhoun in North Carolina, who just unfortunately passed away this spring, was a father of Southern apple research, and his book is great on Southern apples. Tim Brown, also North Carolina, Southern apples. Elwood Fisher passed away a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, a lot of old-timers are gone. He grew over 1,000 varieties in his backyard of the Southern apples. With the old-timers gone, we have new people, millennials coming in. Eliza Greenman is a young lady who does a lot of apple detection in the South, in Virginia, and then Matt Kaminsky up in Massachusetts area. Some of the younger blood coming into the apple research. Kent Wheely in Iowa. Kent Wheely also passed away a couple years ago, but he was the founder of the Seed Savers Exchange, and with the exchange he started the apple orchard. He started to bring the old apples back into the Seed Savers orchard, and then Dan Bussey took over his work, and so that book was a collaboration between Kent Wheely and Dan Bussey, but the Seed Savers Exchange is now at 750 plus apple varieties. And then last but not least, we have North American Fruit Explorers, which is an organization established in the 60s, I believe. And they also have a Facebook page, or you can join the North American Fruit Explorers. They publish some publications, they have annual meetings, and absolutely good group of people to talk to if you're interested in fruits. And USDA has 4,000 to 5,000 apple varieties that are available on their orchards. So here's just a couple of quick pictures of the Montezuma Orchard Restoration Project in southern Colorado. Addie and Jude Schumeyer. I'm talking with Jude here at his orchard under the apple trees. This is their nursery in Colorado with all the little apple seedlings. They're doing a lot of effort to bring the apples back. And here's Kanan, our own Stoic cider. He grows over 250 cider and heirloom apple varieties in his orchard in Williamson Valley, very close to the Fair Oaks orchard. Kanan holds a PhD on apple diversity, and he led me down this rabbit hole path into the apples. So here's Kanan and his brother grafting the little apple trees, and Kanan by the old apple, and in his apple orchard, and Kanan's wife, Tierney, tasting the Stoic cider in the orchard. Kanan's Southwest Apple Research, he did and took genetic material from 280 historic trees over the 3 states of New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. And what it came back once he did that research, 34 named varieties were matched to something, and that's 120 trees, but 160 trees had no match, so 60% of the trees had no match. What does it tell us? Perhaps that maybe the database did not have the apples matching, or maybe perhaps that some of the varieties are lost and they're simply not matching anything. So here I'll show you a little slideshow of different Prescott area apples. A couple trees. You can see how resilient they are. Here is an old oak tree, over 100 years old, from an orchard of 1905. It cracked in half here, but it actually bloomed that spring, bloomed full in bloom, and it produced a few apples. So look at these old beauties from Prescott area, big fat trunks. Sometimes they are all holed out by sapsuckers. Does not seem to hurt them, but you'll see apple trees, and that's one telltale sign that you see little holes in the trunk. Giant apple blossoms and a very tasty crab apple we discovered in one of the old orchards. This will be a little slideshow that just runs through some of the Prescott and Sedona area apples. Presentation of apple blossoms in the spring, which is usually around April 15th that they bloom here in the area. And old apples, still producing some, quite delicious. Some stay on the tree up to the springtime. Sedona Slide Rock area here. Long sprouts on the apple trees. Old roots. Very thick trees. 100+ years old. Sadly, a lot of the orchards that are like this one from 1905 are starting to fall down. The very last of its apple trees are toppling over. So you can see some of the photos in the middle of the winter and the snow. We're trying to take a little piece of the scion wood, and really all you need is about two buds of the fresh growth on a tree to just take that little 2 buds and reproduce a new tree from the same genetics. So a lot of our orchard traveling is mainly in winter. You can see them planted in the rows. This was in a mining area, near a mining camp near Poland, which you had to feed all those miners in Prescott. Poland mine was probably 500 men maybe worked there at the time, so you had to feed them something, and apple orchards were a good source of food. Sedona blossoms, full blossom on the apple tree. Old Sedona apples. There's a little crab apple that tastes really good. And an old Prescott apple that they wanted to remove out of the area, but I think people, neighborhood came together and they left the apple growing. So bringing them back to life, what we are doing is taking that little scion wood piece, the couple of little buds, and grafting them onto a different rootstock or into little apple seedlings or suckers. I have one that's called David's Favorite. We have no idea what it is, but my friend lost her apple tree to a snowstorm this spring, and it was her husband's favorite. So we took that as David's Favorite and grafted it on, so we have it growing now, so they can replant the tree and have the same variety growing. There is a little tree from the old Dendrea tree. I had an image of it, a gigantic tree before. So this is a new little seedling growing from Dendrea tree. I have some from Idaho, red astrakhan, which is a apple that was widely grown in Sedona area. So some trees come from even old apple orchard in Idaho and other parts of the country. This is a few things from my yard. I have a little Jonathan tree that has 12 different varieties grafted onto it, including a very old apple called Suar, Arkansas Black, that came from original Sedona, Arkansas Black, and many others in here. A few more trees. Let's see, Arkansas Black, I think here. And each tree has little tags. We always joke that they look like American flag, white, blue, and red, because we do put red tape to wrap it around the scion, the connection. And then we have a white parafilm underneath, and then we have a blue tag with the name of the apple. So for a while, until we remove all those decorations, they look like decorated Christmas trees. So what can you do if you get interested in these apples? Of course, come to the scion exchanges and grafting workshops, like I mentioned. So you can do all these things. Observe as you hike. Look for apple trees. In the spring, they're easy to spy because of the blossoms. In the fall, they might be easy to spy because of the apples. But otherwise, you have to get familiar with how do they look, how do the leaves look, and how does the bark look. So watch for those trees as you hike. Check out interesting varieties at farmers markets, local farmers markets here. Record the trees if you find them. You can grab a GPS location. You can talk to your neighbors and record their stories of what they have about the old orchards in Prescott. Share your information about those orchards with the community. Teach the children. You can propagate yourself, graft. And of course, come to the scion exchanges and celebrate. We might have apple tastings and fruit tastings here. And of course, the cider tastings in Prescott. Here I'm so happy because I just got in California, apple farm in Philo, California, I just got a whole gallon of fresh apple syrup. And then the resources, if you're interested to dig in more. So again, check out these books. These are just some of my favorites. There's tons and tons of books on apple growing, but these are covering varieties and covering history and covering cool stories. So these are my favorite books. And it's kind of like one from each region. So you have the southern region. Lee Calhoun's Old Southern Apples goes through a lot of different southern varieties. Excellent book. You have Southwest apples in a book called Cider Master of Rio Oscuro. So New Mexico grower Harvey Frauenglass, and he had orchard that he was growing north of Santa Fe. Really great book with really amazing stories of how they restored the old apple orchard back to life and went to the farmer's market to sell the cider and the apples. Frank Browning's from Midwest, Ohio area, Apples, and simply named Apples. Great book that covers the whole history, culture, apple mentions in the old history and people's customs and things like that, literature even. Great book, very fun to read. The brand new book that just came out from Maine, so that's the one I just mentioned, Apples and the Art of Detection. Fun book. We read it with kids, certain sections, lots of cartoons and images in it, and photographs, good sense of humor, well written. Apples and Man, one of the older books, but packed with small book, just 200 pages, written in 70s maybe, by Fred Lape. Really packed with information. So really great book if you just want to pack tons of information about apples in your head in like just one single evening. And then of course the giant encyclopedia that I had here with me. So if you have any questions or comments about the apples, old Prescott orchards, if you want to mention some place you found, you want to discuss anything about the old orchard, contact me at my Yahoo address, christinaniu@yahoo.com. So thank you very much.